Okay, welcome everyone. If I can get my thread up here. I stopped my share. Hopefully everybody can see me just fine. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Dr. Brandon R. Brown. I am the director of the Western Regional Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition and the director for the California Cybersecurity Apprenticeship Program. I would like to thank you today for joining us for our training. We have Jake from Blue Spawn and the University of Virginia, who's going to be going over their threat hunting platform. I don't know if I got that right or not. Jake, I'll let you describe what it is. I know we've had several emails go out to set up VMs for most of you. If you're wanting to participate in that, only thing that I ask is that you kindly write down questions that you have and try to follow along as best you can. This is being recorded. We are live streaming on YouTube right now. I think I threw the link in the chat. I will do so again just for posterity's sake here. So there it is. So you can have it for your records. That'll also be kept on my channel, the One Pro Bro. Like us, follow us on Twitter. Follow me on Twitter. I'm at the One Pro Bro on Twitter. We're going to be doing this next week again with Tenable as well. So they're going to go over their Nessus suite. But I'm going to shut up right now and turn this over to Jake from the University of Virginia's Cyber Defense Team. Jake, please give an introduction of yourself, your product that we're going to see today, and take it away. Jake, I think you're muted, sir.
That would be it. Yep, that would be it. Thank you all for coming out today. It's exciting to see so many folks here, and I'll give a brief introduction about myself here in a few slides from now. But today we'll be talking about Blue Spawn, which is our active defense and EDR tool. It's an open source tool that we started, I guess, a little over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And you'll notice the emphasis on active defense. We very much consider it more on the active defense side, and it's not quite a fully blown EDR that you might be used to, like a CrowdStrike or Carvin Black, but we'll get into more of those details and whatnot here shortly. A few housekeeping notes before we really dive in. You can ask questions in the Zoom chat, although I am not really monitoring the Zoom chat closely. So I'll rely on Dr. Brown to kind of let me know when there's questions and kind of we can stop every so often, but feel free to ask them as they come up and we'll certainly address them. Goal today is obviously to learn something new. Some of it, if you've been doing this kind of thing for a while, it'll be a review. But my goal is that everyone here today walks away with something new. Whether you're just beginning out and this is your first year doing CCDC, or you've been doing this for quite a number of years already. The plan is to go about 2 hours or so today, and we'll do a sort of just like ask me anything at the end here. So I'll be around however long you guys have questions for at the end. So a little bit about me. I actually graduated UVA here in May doing computer science, and throughout my 3 years, I was the Windows team lead for the UVA team. And outside of that, I do a lot of meta-CTF stuff, running CTFs across the US and beyond. So I'm sure some of you have participated or seen meta-CTF events around here and there. But Blue Spawn and the tool and all is not just about me. There is a whole team of us that have been working on this tool really since it started about a year and a half ago. And you'll see many of the names listed here. And there's many names not listed that have been giving us advice, tips, suggestions, ideas for new features, reporting bugs. So with that, we'll go ahead and go into the agenda. So my plan is there's going to be kind of 3 parts, if you will, really one long presentation, but There's kind of broken up into 3 parts. The first part will focus on threat hunting, and then the introduction to Blue Spawn, obviously, and you'll see kind of what we'll cover there. Then we'll be doing the hands-on workshop piece. So all of you received an email probably about 5 minutes ago from me with credentials for an AWS EC2 instance that you'll be able to RDP into. We'll do that during the hands-on portion. So you can just keep that email handy, but you don't need to do anything with it yet unless you really, really want to test your connection. But that'll be there for you. And what we'll do during that part is we'll actually try using Blue Spawn on a live VM to hunt down some malware that's been deployed. And as you can see, let's see if I pop out of this for a second here. Let's see. I've got a whole lot of Cobalt Strike beacons checking in and whatnot. So there is quite a bit of malware and C2 happening. So that'll be fun to go through here. And let's go back into presenter. All right. And then finally, the third part of the workshop today will be a more deep dive, advanced threat hunting. So we'll talk about what it's like in doing and the best ways to go about conducting research, security research to figure out new persistence mechanisms, and really just take stuff you find online and then be able to make that actionable and turn that into a detection. So in Blue Spawn's case, right, we'll kind of walk through how starting with just a MITRE attack page or like a research blog that you see go all the way into writing the code that results in finding a detection. And then we'll talk a bit about the feature of the tool, and then wrap it up. Before I get started, is there any questions?
Let's go ahead and hold questions here towards the end. I'm going to ask just one more time if for everyone, please mute if you have not muted or if I have not muted you, so that we can cut down on all the feedback and everything else. So I'll be monitoring the chat for questions. If I miss your questions, I apologize. But the first one we have here is from Caleb. Will Blue Spawn work on Commando VM Windows, Kali, etc., with no issues? Yeah,
so it'll work on any Windows system and Linux in the future. So we're still working on a Linux client.
Okay. So it's Windows. It's Windows based primarily. Yep. Windows 10 only, or is it backward compatible?
It'll run on anything 7 and above.
Gotcha. Perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, we decided it was time to drop support for XP. All right. Yeah. Anything else, or should I dive right in?
There's a question about the availability of YouTube. I put the URL in there. That URL will exist in perpetuity until I die and my YouTube channel is extricated or there's a world-ending event. So the URL that I put in the chat is good. Let me see. There it is again for y'all that may have joined a little bit later. So I'll try to come back to any questions. Take it away, Jake, please.
Awesome. So first things, why we're here today. When I approached CCDC, the idea is that we're all sitting on computers, all of the defenders at least, and red team is operating basically right in front of us. And at least in my opinion, malware should not be able to execute right in front of us defenders like that without us knowing. So that's kind of why we're here. We want to be able to figure out the fastest way that we can get on any arbitrary box and lock it down, secure it, and then find all the any and all malware, persistence, red team beacons, etc., on that box as fast as possible, and then root it out and respond, delete it, stop the process, etc., etc. And so that's kind of the whole mindset background into this is Blue Spawn's. The idea behind it is to be able to surface as much possible information to you as quickly as possible so you can go ahead and take care of it. And that's kind of starting to get at what we think of as active defense. In case you're not familiar with CCDC as much, basically you receive a mix of Windows, Linux, Palo Alto firewalls, or other types of firewalls. And you're basically asked to secure these 10, 15, 20, however many machines against an active red team. And those active red teamers are generally industry professionals that have been doing this a while and move really, really fast and are really, really good at what they do. And it's a great testing ground, though, for figuring out testing defensive tools, practicing incident response skills, because you're doing this in real time. And it's hard to kind of set up a lab and feel what it's like to be under active attack by someone outside of this kind of environment. And the red teams will use everything from pretty simple tools, so like Metasploit or many of the C2 frameworks that are publicly available, and some paid ones like Cobalt Strike, all the way down to writing custom malware just to hack into the student blue teams. Isn't that exciting? This is an example network map from one of the regional events last year. As you can see, there's kind of a mix of everything, and it's modeled after what would be like a real corporate environment. So you have workstation machines, and that's what your average user would be using. You have a handful of servers, whether that's Windows or Linux. You might have Active Directory. You might have various WordPress and other types of applications. And then maybe you even have a quote unquote cloud part where you're hosting, where your fake company is hosting things in the cloud. So that's just an example network map to give you context of how Blue Spawn fits into, I guess, the broader objective of securing your network and finding any malware that's running in it. So objectives for today, basic familiarity with threat hunting and active defense. So we're going to be looking into just how you go about conceptually finding threats. It's bigger than just one tool. So the methodologies and concepts you learn are just as important, if not even more important, than using any sort of tool, whether that's Blue Spawn, whether that's Sysinternals, whether that's Process Hacker. So keep that in mind. Think about how you can apply these concepts broadly, and that'll be what's really helpful to you going forward. And we're going to figure out how we can wield these tools to our advantage to find that malware. And of course, we'll get some hands-on practice with Blue Spawn here. So some of the available tools before we get into some of the specifics. First, in the last several years, of course, there's been a lot of what's known as EDR, EPP, so like endpoint detection and response, enterprise protection platform, next generation AV, you name it, there's an acronym for it. But the trends across this defensive environment is that they're getting lower and lower level. So you have that kind of kernel level privileges and monitoring across all of your devices. Support is still, I guess, a bit weak in my opinion for non-Windows devices, but the commercial vendors are slowly getting there and doing a lot better job. And before, AVs were pretty simple. They just looked for very specific strings with hard-coded signatures. But now they've evolved to a lot more to be able to detect, respond, actually like delete or take action and stop the malware, even if it doesn't have a signature with it beforehand. But one of the downsides to that is AVs in 2020 are still quite a bit of a black box. You don't really know well what they can detect or what they can't detect. Generally speaking, at least maybe someone's doing it, but generally these vendors aren't sharing all the signatures and the exact detection code of how their tool works with you, which can make it difficult to figuring out what you can defend against and what you might not be able to see if an attacker does in your environment. And with any tool, it certainly requires tuning. So there could be false positives, there's false negatives, all that sorts of things. But generally speaking, these tools are doing a really, really good job in raising the bar for attackers and making it harder for malware to execute undetected. but you often don't have these kinds of tools at a CCDC environment because you're using only using free and open source software, or at least free software that you can download, such as Sysinternals. Sysinternals, if you're not familiar, is a fantastic set of tools. I think of them generally as system analysis tools. So you can use them for basically anything, looking at processes, monitoring, troubleshooting, debugging. And they're great because they're written by Microsoft, so they have great first-party support. They can do a lot of good things like recording all process executions very simply. But a lot of the time you have to know kind of what you're looking for, and that takes a lot of time and effort for the average defender. They have to know exactly what they're looking at, and we're all human, so it's very easy to miss some auto run that just blends in just well enough to fly under the radar, for example. And the other thing is that Sysinternals isn't meant to be a security tool. So while it's very helpful in CCDC, it doesn't mark out a threat and say like, this is process injection, or this is an example of run key malware, or this malware is using scheduled tasks. You kind of have to make those kind of leaps yourself, which makes it difficult for kind of incident response efforts and tracking down malware, at least as quickly as you would probably be able to do. Here's a couple more tools. One is Process Hacker. Process Hacker is pretty similar to Process Explorer, but is an open source tool, and it kind of combines a lot of the Sysinternals tools into one. So you can click on a process and then jump right into viewing the memory sections of it, which could help you find process injection pretty easily. But it's not very automated. It's still kind of that manual threat hunting. You're using your brain pretty heavily to go scroll through the view and kind of look for badness. PECIV is one of my favorite tools. It's basically really good open source tool for hunting down process injection. And it has an accompanying tool called Hollows Hunter. So they kind of both can work in tandem. Hollows Hunter uses PECIV under the hood, and they're both made by the same person. But generally what they do is they look for abnormalities in the processes to spot things like process injection, process doppelganging, and all those other process related attacks that you'll often see attackers utilize to hide. I mean, the one downside, if there is a downside, is that it's limited to process activity. So it's not going to look for stuff like registry run keys and all, but it does a fantastic job at hunting down process injection. And we actually use it internally in Blue Swan as well. The other kind of main tool, I guess, main sets of tools for defenders is probably the rule collections and hardening scripts. So one example is Sigma. Another one is the Yara Rules project and the various other repositories of signatures available online. It's taken a while, at least since I've been in the InfoSec community, to get better at sharing detections. And it's nice to see that more and more people are doing that. And they're standardizing around tools like Yara or Sigma that can standardize how a detection can be written, and that makes it a lot more modular. And we'll get into why that's important here too, briefly. And then there's hardening scripts. Hardening scripts are, some are good, some are bad. You'll find plenty of random scripts that people have published on the internet. And with all things published on the internet, it could be good and it could be bad. But there are some good ones out there. Some you'll find will set conflicting things, which makes it tricky for a defender because you have to really audit all the tools you're using. But there are great examples like sysmon configurations that people have published that do a great job that you can utilize to help your threat hunting. Here's an example of a Sigma rule. And you'll notice a few key parts of it. There's a lot of very useful metadata. But what I want to really highlight here is the tags. So the tags are all related to MITRE ATT&CK in this case. And we'll talk about MITRE ATT&CK more lately, but that's a very useful tool for thinking about threat hunting, figuring out how a red team is going to attack your system, and understand really how to stop it too. So you have to understand the attacks before you can stop them. And it's really nice to see when signatures map this too. So you're like, oh, this is technique 1564 sub technique 3. And then you can go pull that up and look and figure out exactly what it is. And then here in the command line section, you'll kind of see an example. This is just one open source rule that I came across, and it's actually used to detect the Covenant command and control framework. And you can see it's looking for different types of encoded PowerShell commands. And if it sees that, it'll alert on that. So Sigma is more of looking at logs, while Yara, the next one we'll look at, is aimed to be looking at like files and other basically blobs of data. And it can search for everything from just raw hex bytes to various strings that are found. And it's a condition, it uses conditions, so you can mix and match. You can say, I want 2 out of these 4 things to match, and if so, generate an alert. And it's great to see like reference points here. These will help map the signatures to some threat that was observed in the real world, a blog post, some attacker technique. And so these are all really important tools for going about finding threats. And it's a matter of figuring out how we can take all the research that's done to detect various forms of malware, and then figure out how to apply that quickly to stopping threats, especially in the case of CCDC. On that note, I figured I'd add a slide in here, kind of at least my opinion about where the defensive environment is going in CCDC in coming years. When I first competed, I guess 3 years ago, it seemed like blue teams were still very much struggling at sort of what I'll call the middle ground. So just spotting basic things like Metasploit, or figuring out like registry run keys with auto runs. A lot of those techniques were heavily used by attackers, and at least for me, it seems like a lot of the blue teams were struggling with that. But then over the last couple of years, it certainly seemed to me that people have gotten a lot better at figuring out those basic attacker techniques and being able to stop them. And so what I'm guessing for the next 3 to 5 years is that that's going to push the red team and the blue team down to a bit more lower level OS components. So like kernel level and drivers and things like that, as well as higher into kind of the application security. It seems that a lot of teams still struggle with the application security side of things. So
let me chime in there real quick, Jake, because you bring up an excellent point. That all starts with the operations, AKA black team, that has to set the environment up. Because if they don't set up the environment with the gigs that are in there, the vulnerabilities in there, red team has no attack surface to go after.
Yep.
Right. And what we've gotten better at doing, at least in the Western region, and I've seen it at the national level as well, is coming up with some of this crazy stuff for the red team to find. It's almost as much fun for the red team as it is for the blue teams to attack it, to find it. I've had a lot of red team members at both the regional and national level tell me in the last couple of years that it is a lot of fun because they're finding out new ways to find stuff. So it's interesting to hear this from both sides. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt too much.
No, that's a great point. And certainly I've seen teams struggle a lot with some of the basic like application security settings, not patching like their websites and whatnot. So being teams, it's all about thinking about the attack surface here in defending effectively in CCDC or the real world. And that's looking all the way down to those lower level components to kind of the stuff that attackers are going to do that should be able to be pretty easily caught. And then even finding stuff at the higher level, like application security. And that's just really important. And a lot of the operating systems these days are getting a lot more secure by default. So think like Windows 10 is a lot more secure by default than, say, Windows XP was a decade ago. And so that's pushing the red team to exploit a lot of misconfigurations. There will always be vulnerabilities, but in general, things like protections on the LSAS process on Windows have gotten a lot better in recent years and made it a lot harder to dump credentials. So thinking about how you can defend, quickly spot misconfigurations and then defend against them is, I would say, very, very important. So we've talked a lot about kind of some background, some of the available tools, and now we'll get into more about what actually Bluespawn is, as opposed to talking about other things. Is there any questions, I guess, really quick, before we keep diving in? Doesn't look like any. Awesome. Okay, so back into, I guess, April of 2019, I went back and looked at the Slack history. We were have competed in CCDC for a couple years at that point, and we were really struggling with some of the limits of the Sysinternals tools and Process Hacker being able to quickly find stuff and then map it to MITRE ATT&CK. So we started using MITRE ATT&CK, which I promise I'll talk about in a few slides if you're not familiar with it. But we were trying to use that to identify our attack surface and figure out where we could detect the red team. And we didn't see a lot of just free tools to do that. Some of the open source like antivirus tools like ClamAV have become several years old at this point and not as updated as frequently. So we were really in search of something and we couldn't see much out there. So we decided to build our own tool, and that's, I wonder if we could build it, starts a lot of conversations that you don't realize how much work they're going to be until you start doing them. So the original idea was more towards like an active defense tool, quickly identifying threats, figuring out how to react to them. And react means deleting a file, deleting a registry key, killing a process, things like that. Next thing, know our coverage. Know our coverage is something I'll spend a lot of time on here pretty shortly. It's very, very important, just like we talked about, knowing your attack surface before you can defend. Understanding the different components and where red team is likely to live is so important. And then finally, more open source blue team software. There's a lot of offensive security tools, as people call them, OSTs out there. Whether that's C2 frameworks, whether that's proof of concepts to do exploits or process injection, you name it, there's probably 5 to 10 tools at a minimum for any individual topic out there that does more offensive security tools or red team type operations. And there's not a whole lot of blue team software out there. The couple tools we mentioned at the beginning really are mostly the only tools available that are really heavily used, that are both free and open source out there. And even like Sysinternals, that's a closed source example. And then everything else has traditionally lied in the vendor space and in the commercial space. So that's just kind of a challenge for getting your hands on and really finding, doing your own research and playing around with some base level of tooling. And then as we got more into building Bluespawn, we definitely transitioned more towards active defense, basically continually monitoring the system for threats. So instead of just doing a point in time scan, what if we're continually watching for new process spawns and then analyzing them? Or we're watching a registry key, and then as soon as it changes, go generate, first go scan it, and then if it's bad, go ahead and alert on it. And then you can even take that through all the way to monitor. You see a change, you scan it, and then you make a decision. And that's kind of the long-term goals for Blue Spawn. And then network defense, we're still, I guess, very much in our initial stages of this, but over time, our idea, maybe we'll see if it's in for this season, but moving towards a network defense. So like if you see some sort of registry run key that's malicious on one machine, the rest of the machines in your fleet automatically know about it. So as soon as you see one detection, you can go search out all the other machines in your network to see if they have the same malware and if they're compromised. And that just speeds up your incident response efforts. And then the other thing is proactive defense. I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of just various scripts on the internet that claim to harden your box and set just lots of registry keys with almost no context of what those registry keys are. And that makes it very difficult as a defender to understand how you're securing your system and to what standard. So are you protected against X attack? I don't know. Like there was just the script, you ran the script and it set 50 run keys or 50 registry keys, excuse me. And so that makes it really hard to understand what you're protected against. So one of the things we're moving towards is kind of like a proactive defense where we are defining mitigations and that are mapped to frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK or STIGs, which we'll get into. This is probably one of my favorite slides in the presentation today. We've had a lot of people ask us that, all right, if you're going to release an open source tool, especially for use in CCDC, that means that the red team is just going to watch it all year. And that means they'll make their changes to their malware so that your tool doesn't detect it. And certainly that's definitely the case. I mean, they'll certainly are going to make changes based on make changes to their tooling based on looking at Blue Spawn and experimenting it in their own labs. But red teamers, in my experience, can be lazy too. So there's plenty of things that they might not change. And certainly, so it's a balance, yes. But at the end of the day, in how I kind of think about it, there's a finite number of techniques that attackers are going to be able to use to attack you. And we'll see that here shortly. And so what you want to do as a defender is to look at your lines of effort. That's more of a military term, but you're basically figuring out how you spend your time in protecting your system. So whether that's looking for evidence of process injection or looking for evidence of a specific other attacker technique, right? And each one that you look at helps to reduce the attacker's ability to effectively use that tool. So you might, in some cases, you might be able to apply a setting and prevent them from using that altogether. But even if you just have a solid detection for one particular technique, that's one less thing that the attacker is going to be able to use as effectively against you as they might have been before. So it's all about raising the bar. And if you raise the bar far enough, it's going to really complicate the attacker's efforts. So this is an example of Blue Spawn's current coverage map. So this is the MITRE ATT&CK framework I keep referencing without showing. And it's broken into various attacker tactics. And so that's initial access, execution, persistence, privilege escalation, defense evasion, credential access, discovery, lateral movement, collection, and I think there's actually might be a couple more now. And don't worry if those terms are a bit foreign to you or you've never heard of them or they sound very crazy and complicated. That's what this framework is designed to do. And you'll see that everything we define a hunt for makes it that much harder for red team to effectively use against us. If they're not able to rely on registry run keys, for example, I like to pick on, that's one thing that, one less thing that you have to worry about quite as much. And so they also kind of become landmines is how I think about them in my mind. Every time from like a defense in depth strategy, every time that an attacker has to rely on one of those techniques that you have good coverage for, they're risking themselves being detected. And so if you force them to use those kinds of techniques, you're going to be able to find them. They'll trip up and they'll use one, and then you'll be like, ha, I found you. And then you start unraveling the thread and finding the rest of the red team malware on the system. And that can be very complicated. And even for me, who's been looking at MITRE ATT&CK and reading the framework for years now, every time I open it, I find something new. And I'll be like, huh, I never even knew about that technique before. So there you can dive in and do a little, and then you can stay and for years and you'll still be learning stuff. So that's kind of just the depth and breadth that the attack framework covers. But in the end of the day, it really forces the attackers to change their techniques, and that changing their techniques is a lot harder than just changing their tooling. And it also lets you focus on other things. So if you're looking at, if you've got a good detection for a certain technique, that means you can spend more of your time looking at one of those techniques that you don't have as good of a detection for. And that really helps you in your coverage. I saw a question about what are the yellow areas. The yellow areas are what we've termed like weaker detection. So the blue is kind of like a strong blue spawn coverage for that particular technique. And then the yellows are weaker, a lot weaker detections. They still exist, but they're not as reliable, or they generate more false positives, or they just don't cover all of attacker behavior in that area as well as we'd like it to.
Is there a plan to tighten that up at any point in time?
Yep.
Or is it just something that you have to be aware of that it might be a false positive?
Both, kind of. So,
okay.
Yeah, as we built the tool, we get better and better at reducing false positives. And false positives are really, really hard to remove in CL cases. And that's something that real commercial vendors who have dozens, if not hundreds of people on their development teams struggle with finding. But blue spawn errs, and I'll get into this more, but it errs on surfacing the threat and letting you make the decision of whether it's malicious or not. So it wants to at least see the thing and let you know that it's possibly malicious, and let you make the final determination. So at least you have that visibility into, hey, there's something there, as opposed to not even knowing that it existed in the first place.
So it gets your attention basically, and then you can dig into it further.
Yep.
Just good, forensics incident response practice. Got it. Perfect.
Exactly. So into the more about threat hunting methodology. I told you that we try to talk more than just blue spawn, and these slides are meant to do that, because at the end of the day, you're going to go back and think about how to better protect your team's systems while they're under attack by the red team. And you may be using blue spawn, you may not be, but you really want to figure out how to stop them. And that's where all of the threat hunting kind of conceptually comes in. So, and we were actually just talking about this, as Dr. Brown mentioned just a minute ago. So AVs and EDRs are meant to be somewhat quiet, especially in the corporate world. They don't want to have a high false positive rate. And that means that they might see things and not alert you that they're there. And that generally is a good thing. You don't want a huge alert fatigue, I think is what a lot of people call it. If you're constantly seeing false positives, then that's really tricky to figure out what are the true detections in there. But in CCDC, you generally want to tend to be on looking at everything, whether it's a false positive or not, just because you don't have quite as many machines to defend. So a real enterprise might have tens of thousands of endpoints, and it's a lot harder if there's lots of false positives to sort through. But you don't have that problem in CCDC, or at least not yet. I'll look forward to the days where every team has to defend like 5,000 machines or 10,000 machines. That would be quite an adventure.
I don't look forward to that day because the team has to set it up.
Yeah.
So no.
We might be pushing the limits of AWS if that ever happens.
Yeah, and that also gets quite expensive in AWS as well, unless AWS is going to be your sponsor, which I'm actually trying to get that accomplished for the Western region, but we'll see how it goes. Good point, though. Yeah, we can dream. We can always dream.
Yep. Yeah, so Blue Spawn is meant to be loud. It values finding the possible detections, over necessarily precision. But as we go on, we'll be able to have more data and collect more data and then reduce some of those false positives. And the goal is to carefully analyze everything and anything on the system when we're thinking about active defense. So taking into account a number of different data sources, whether that's event logs, whether that's registry, whether that's file system, processes. Malware is going to touch one of those items. If it doesn't touch one of those items, it probably isn't executing or scheduled to execute. And at the end of the day, all malware has to run in some way, shape, or form. So it's very important to look to analyze as much of the attack surface as possible and figure out where evidence of an attack might lie. And so that might be actively running when it's in processes, but it very much could be in the event logs looking after the fact, and you would know that something malicious happened. And then when we say active defense, we're talking about bridging that gap between incident response and EDR. So making it a lot easier to actively respond to the malware you find, as well as detect it in the first place. So kind of that full spectrum and do kind of the mapping for you. So instead of just being like, hey, this is Win32/CMOK bang 32, like a Windows Defender alert and how it might categorize something, we want to try to understand that, oh, it wasn't just Mimikatz XYZ. It was the malware was trying to dump credentials on the system. And that helps you better understand the attack so you can effectively mitigate it and even just say what happened on the system. And we think about that very much in terms of hunts. Hunts is basically, all right, let's use MITRE attack techniques. Those are known attacker techniques. Let's figure out how we go hunt for them. And let's use all the data sources available to us to make that happen. And monitor mode, which we'll talk about, also does the same thing. So it's basically continuously running these hunts in the background that we've set up. And then MITRE attack sub-techniques were a new thing, but they're handled inside of kind of a broad overarching hunt. So one hunt can look for many different types of malware and things. And malicious behavior has multiple connections or multiple components usually. So if you find a malicious process, it might be spawned by a malicious registry key. So it's very important to track down the source of the malware and not just fight the symptoms of it. It's very, very easy in CCDC to fight the symptoms of malware. And I've done it. We've all done it in the past where you're like, oh, you see the red team shell popping up, and instead of solving the problem, you write a script to kill the beacon when it pops up and just kill the process every time it spawns. But that's not going to help you if the malware is going to keep spawning because you didn't remove the registry key at the source of it. And Blue Spawn takes that into account by trying to identify connections and associated evidence. So when it finds one, if it looks at one registry key and it sees that references a file, then it's going to look at both of those. So let's talk about features. I feel like I'm talking a lot, so we're going to try to go a bit faster through this section to get into the hands-on workshop. A few notes. Blue Spawn is very much still an active alpha development. So there are bugs. The code base is probably north of 15 or 20,000 lines of C++ at this point, and it's all written pretty much from the ground up. So there is plenty of bugs that certainly exist, but over time those get fixed, just like all software. So there's 5 core components. that we'll talk about. First is mitigate, then hunt, scan, monitor, and react. So mitigate is the idea that we want to quickly secure our system as possible. And part of that is applying good policies. And if we can mitigate the vulnerability in the first place, then we're covered. We don't have to worry about looking for an attacker if they can't exploit that specific loophole. And so these are still somewhat recent and not as fleshed out, but conceptually is we want to basically set mitigate mode will help you set various security settings on your computer, or even if you don't want to set them, at least audit them to tell you if you're protected or not against them. So the next module that we'll talk about is scan. Here's some terminology. A detection may or may not be bad, at least in terms of blue spawn. And then every detection has an associated certainty. So that's how malicious something is. And then the association is one detection will almost certainly be related to some other detection. And so that kind of builds out a network of things of interest on the computer. And that's what can link malware to identify all of its different components. So the scan module in Blue Spawn is the thing that evaluates. So hunts and everything will identify things of interest, but then the scan module is what figures out like, hey, I give you the thumbs up or thumbs down, whether that actually is malicious or not. And it does that through YARA rules. It does that through looking at signatures on a file and various other criteria that you'll be able to look into the code to figure out how it comes to the decision. There's no machine learning yet, so it's pretty simple in how it reaches a score. Maybe one day there will be some hand wavy machine learning magic. But this is kind of under the hood in the heap of how Blue Spawn under the hood handles detections, and you'll see that there's information associated with a detection, and then it has information about what it was scanned. It say this detection number 2, oh, it's of type registry, so it has registry related data. So what registry key it points to, what data was found, and it can point and be linked to other detections, and that's where that network again comes from. So Hunt, designed to cover any arbitrary MITRE attack technique. So for example, Hunt technique 1547 sub technique 001, that looks for registry run keys and startup items. Registry, so it has registry related data. And so it looks like we have some background. Someone's not muted there.
I'll work on that. Keep going.
Yep, you're good. But so a hunt is going to check for various different data sources. So it's going to look in the registry, the file system, anywhere that you might find evidence of an attacker, it's going to scan and evaluate. Most items might just receive a quick scan of just some very quick features, just like checks. Is it signed? Is it of a certain extension before making a decision? Well, you could have, or on then the higher side, a more invasive scan will say, all right, apply all the YARA rules in our database and scan the bytes of the file to see if there's anything malicious in there. And they're broken up into sub techniques and subsections just to kind of for code quality. So I know this might be hard to read. We'll kind of walk through, and it seems complicated, but once you get into writing them, it becomes a lot simpler than it looks. And you only have to write them once, which is nice. So here's a hunt. We're looking for sub technique 004, and this is the raw C++ code that powers Blue Spawn for this particular hunt. So this is exactly, show me the code here. It's saying, all right, we're looking at level cursory. We're going to use a regex to look for any value that's not explorer.exe in this particular registry key. And if it finds something that's not default, so it should just be explorer.exe in that key. But attackers might add their own piece of malware to it to execute. And if it finds that is the case, then you can go create a detection with certainty level moderate, because you're pretty sure it's likely malicious, or at least something that you as a defender want to know about for further investigation. And then you say it's a file reference. And you check other registry keys the same way. And you'll see in the run hunt method up here, there's other sub techniques that more fully cover the broader technique of 1547, which I believe is auto start, or something related to event driven execution, I think.
So I have a question for you real quick, Jake.
Yep.
Putting my developer hat on here real quick. Do you have these hunts acting in sequence? Are they acting simultaneously? And then I have a follow-up to that real quick after you're done.
Yeah, so the hunts, when you run a hunts, the program is multi-threaded, so it's running them in parallel oftentimes. And then in monitor mode, which we'll talk about, it's basically it's subscribing to operating system changes. So anytime a registry key changes, it'll trigger the hunts that care about that and are interested in that particular registry key.
All right. How many threads is it running usually? And is that something that you can set as the operator?
That is not something you can currently set. I'm not exactly sure how many threads it usually is running. I'll have to double check on that.
No problem. I was just, that's leading to my ultimate question is, what's the system requirements to run this? Because with a lot of AVs and other EDRs, they're just processor or memory hogs on a system. So what's the performance curve on this as far as what type of system it'll run on, especially since it's right now your client's in Windows?
Yeah. As long as the system has even 2 gigs of RAM, even 1 gig of RAM, we haven't seen too many problems. It'll just take longer. But one of the ways we have to mitigate that is kind of the different modes. So the aggressiveness. So there's like a cursory mode that's going to do quick checks. And then there's more invasive modes that are like normal and then intensive. And normal will scan every process, but then intensive will go beyond that and start looking at modules, looking at even more registry keys that are of interest. And that's kind of something to help kind of their performance level.
Okay, cool.
Thanks. From monitor, each hunt registers. Perfect. We were just talking about this. Each hunt registers events to look for. So it might subscribe to say the registry run key is HKLM system or like software Microsoft current version run, I believe. And it's going to subscribe to that registry key. So whenever that registry key changes in the operating system, it'll know to run hunt technique 1547 sub technique 001. And that helps kind of the performance and better nail down exactly what is of interest to not rerun every single hunt, for example. We're working on event deduplication. And then eventually, as we go on, monitor mode will have kernel level components inject itself into every single process to closely monitor all API calls. It might use ETW, which is event tracing for Windows. So as I talked about, that further push
a family of 4
to closer down to the operating system, that will help to find threats and make sure they can't evade blue spawn or any other AV for that matter. Looks like we might have some background music in some background.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm trying to find the user.
No worries.
Please mute out if you are.
So we'll keep going. Monitor mode. Here is the example of some of the code behind it. So you'll see it's subscribing to registry events. It's subscribing to file system events. So every time there is every time there is a file change or whatnot in this particular folder, then it'll go no to rerun the sub technique or subsection located with it. And for this particular one, it was looking for the presence of any newly installed application shims. And while I'm thinking about it, one quick thing is that we're writing these hunts, and we've basically codified and written down logic that we would have otherwise had to look through. So if we can if we can have our code look for one registry key, that's one that we don't have to look for during the competition. And next is the final mode, I believe, is React. So React is basically how we think about and do detections. By default, we're going to log them. We want evidence that the attack or that the detection occurred. But then we have reactions like delete file, delete registry entry, suspend process, carve its memory. And we'll talk about carve memory in a second here, because that's probably the coolest reaction that we have. And then it knows to mark it as stale as something changed. So if we delete the file, the detection is no longer active if it successfully removed the malware file. Here's that memory carving reaction that I mentioned, and we'll get to try that out here very, very shortly, I promise. That basically goes in, and I won't read through all the steps here, but say you have evidence of process injection on the system, it'll go in the memory into that process where the injected code is living and basically remove the beacon while repairing the process and letting the process continue to execute fine. But then it'll kill the attacker's beacon, which is obviously exciting. It just partially suspends the process, goes in and does its patching, and then leaves the attacker with their code not running on the system and the process still intact. So some integrations, MITRE ATT&CK, we've talked about that a lot. Yara, we mentioned before, that Bluespawn uses for its rules. And being able to write a Yara rule makes it a lot easier. So you don't have to write C++ code if you can just write a Yara rule to add functionality to the program. We have STIGs, and those are published by various different organizations. And then PECIV, which we talked about, that is what we use under the hood for process scanning. So that was a lot. I know it was a lot, but to kind of put it in one graphic is all about how we think about defense, how we think about hunting down malware on our system. And we look at it from a prevention standpoint. So figuring out what security settings we can apply, a detection standpoint. So how can we detect XYZ technique? What data sources do we need to do it? And how are we going to monitor that in real time for when those occur? And then response is when we find something of interest, how are we going to react to it and stop it? And then of course, logging. We can log to console, but we can also support XML and very soon to be JSON logging, and that'll help your reporting efforts because it's structured logs and all. So we're going to go through some examples of Bluespawn in action, then we'll skip to the workshop part. So these are screenshots from various cyber defense competitions this past year, this past CCDC season. This is what attackers' consoles usually look like, courtesy of Dave Cowan and the NCCDC Red Team, deface web applications and whatnot. But we obviously want to prevent those, and that's where Bluespawn and your other tools come in. So the better we get at threat hunting as the defense side, the less shells they have calling back. And that's obviously better. So here's an example. We're going to catch process injection of Cobalt Strike here. And so I know this is a lot to see here, but basically we have it found process injection. It found a malicious PowerShell. So we had these two beacons that we're calling back. One was in PowerShell.exe, one was in Explorer. And it found the PowerShell one. And here's that carve memory reaction. It was like, hey, do you want to carve out this infected section of memory that we located? And then it goes and patches it, taking those steps we saw a few slides ago. and terminates, it keeps the PowerShell process running in this case, but it deletes where the attacker's beacon and their injected code lives. So it no longer works. And then it also found that beacon that was in explorer.exe, and it did the same thing where we're carving out that infected section of memory and making sure it can't execute, which leaves us with something like this, which is great for us as defenders. There's no more attacker beacons checking in, and the processes, if they were running in like explorer.exe, our explorer.exe process didn't crash or anything. It's still usable. And here is a nice simple one, sticky keys backdoor, a classic one that the red team likes to deploy. And it's pretty simple, but Blue Spawn was able to find it, which means that's one less thing you have to look for. And it found it and prompted you to remove the value to delete that sticky keys backdoor. And we can see some of the command lines at the top, which we'll get into more in a few slides. But basically, the mode is hunt. The aggressiveness is normal in this case. We can specify to look for one specific attacker technique or multiple. And then how are we going to output logs, log-wise, and then how do we want to react to any threats found? Here's one. This was probably pretty exciting, or it was pretty exciting when we found it live in a competition this year. One of the more obscure techniques that's not as commonly used by attackers is something called an authentication package in Windows. And we found in one of the competitions where the red team had installed adsec.dll, registered it as a Windows package that's able to handle authentication. And this is a great example of one of those things where you might not have time to hunt for, but if it's coded in, it can certainly do the heavy lifting. You can let the code look for, and you're automatically covered. So you don't have to worry as much about looking for this particular piece of attacker technique. And you can instead focus your time on other areas. All right, the next is registry run keys. We've mentioned this quite a bit. These are my favorite. They're such a classic attacker technique, but Blue Spawn here is finding the registry run key and identifying them so you can go ahead and delete them. Here's a web shell. Red team likes web shells. Defenders do not like web shells. And so this is a great example, though, of looking at YARA rules. So there's YARA rules in the system or in the program that are just public YARA rules that people have built that look for suspicious PHP function calls, looks for PHP malware. And Blue Spawn uses those YARA rules to scan all web-related files in the system in like web accessible directories. And then it can go make a report for you and be like, oh, I found a web shell. Here were the malicious YARA rules that it matched. It didn't match any of the more indicator YARA rules, but it looked at a number of malicious YARA rules. And so that leads us to think that we're pretty confident that it's malware. And the great thing is that, I guess, I forgot to mention, is that it could just be a standalone web shell, or maybe it's hidden in a file, in another file, for example. So instead of scanning all the code yourself, you're using the YARA rules to go ahead and look for all the malware. Another one, create and modify service. Windows services really should generally not be running CMD as the service executable name, and certainly not Intel graphics user service. So looking for anomalies like that. And that goes back to knowing normal will help you find evil. So if you know what is default on a system, you can better figure out what might be malicious activity, whether from red team or an actual attacker. So we'll kind of breeze through this. Last year was the first time the red team really had to deal with Blue Spawn. And they said like they created their own counter tool called Red Spawn, funny enough. And it tried to limit Blue Spawn's effectiveness, and it did in some ways, and it failed to do that in other ways, at least in our opinion. So that's a good thing, right? It forced the attackers to use new techniques, and it really gave them some trouble in certain areas. So if we can make the red team's job harder, it's going to make your job easier as blue teamers, because if you're always having to change your attack techniques, then that's really difficult to deal with year in and year out. And on our side of things, it definitely helped us respond faster, which was good. One of, I think, the key points for us was a kind of force multiplier. So we use Blue Spawn a lot in a way that we would put it in the hands of our Linux team. And so they might be using a Windows workstation. So if they could run Blue Spawn on their Windows workstation, even though they were Linux focused, they didn't have to know a whole lot about Windows defense. They just ran the tool, and if it flagged anything, then they would call one of us over to look at it. If it didn't flag anything, we could have confidence that they were at least decently secure. There wasn't any obvious red team malware on the system. And so instead, and the other thing would be, of course, lots of making the manual effort a lot less manual and automating the detection process. Okay. I think we're going to skip the demo section.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Unless you want to do it real quick, I don't know how long it takes you. Let's just pause here real quick and see if there's any questions. I don't think I have anything other than people trying to train me how to use Zoom, which I'm cool with. That's good. I had a couple of questions. First off, at nationals and or your regional last year, how long did it take you to set this up in your Windows clients? How fast did it deploy?
As fast as you can download a file and run a single command, because right now we don't have it as an installer. So as fast as you can type out /bluespawn.exe in the command line, that's how fast you can start getting.
So not a lot of scripting that could help you with that automation at all. Okay, perfect. We had a question in chat. Is there a way to disable or prioritize specific attack techniques?
Yep. And so here's an example from a few slides ago, where basically we could, if we're only interested in like a certain technique and we knew its number, we could specify Blue Spawn and tell it to only look for boot or log on auto start execution, for example.
Okay. So is it primarily looking for flags of like common Metasploit or other framework payloads? Yep. Or is it kind of, okay. That's what I thought. It's kind of, as I was tracking along, that's what I grasped.
Yeah, it's looking for anomalies, common LOL bins, using the R rules, things like that. Yep.
All right, and then there's another question here from Tyler. Is there any plans to make this a server-side Oh, wow, Tyler, you took the question right from me, man. Good job. A server-side program versus running it on every client. My question was going to be, is there going to be like a client-server mode where you have like a central reporting system, or can this integrate into Splunk at all? That was another question I had.
Yeah, so we have the XML logging that you could feed in theory to a SIEM or any other thing.
Okay.
We are working on the server component. We haven't gotten it fully working as an MVP model. We've instead built out the client a lot, because building out a fully functional server and doing it in a scalable way takes time, but we're really close to an initial version of that though, actually.
Okay.
So, yep, stay tuned.
Perfect. The Randolph Morse team has Blue Spawn been tested running alongside other monitoring software? So have you ran it and can either, in conjunction with or side by side with any other type of AV or SIEM or anything like that?
Yeah. So for example, like Defender and whatnot, if Defender's running, Blue Spawn is just another tool that can be run certainly alongside it. And they can work along side by side just fine. And maybe Windows Defender will spot stuff that Blue Spawn didn't, and vice versa. So yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So Robinson Tran had a question about defensive strategies for Linux machines. As it was stated earlier on, Robinson. They do not have a client for BlueSpawn yet for Linux. I think they're working on one. If I picked that up correctly.
Yep.
So stay tuned. All right, that's all the questions I have for now in chat. Let's go ahead and press forward. We have a little under an hour left, and if we go over, I'm okay with that because this is good. This is good stuff.
Awesome.
So drive on, sir. Drive on.
And just to add on to that, we generally, so I didn't work much on the Linux side when I was there, but yeah, our team generally used a pretty similar approach with understanding what attackers were doing, looking holistically. We didn't have a nice automated tool for it, but the same kinds of techniques are really agnostic of operating systems. And that's what makes it so valuable to go beyond just the BlueSpawn tool here and really think about exactly MITRE ATT&CK has plenty of techniques mapped for Linux operating systems. So you can look through and learn about those and figure out how to apply those to hunting malware on Linux. And we'll soon have a Linux client as one way to do that, but there's certainly other ways you could build your own tool, or even knowing what to look for is so valuable because there's plenty of places you can hide on Windows, Linux, any operating system.
So to that point, let me ask this from a corporate standpoint. What about Mac? I mean, Mac is, it still has the same structure that Linux has. Would that port over? Are you looking at other types of distributions? Because there's different, tree structures in Berkeley Linux, FreeBSD versus everything else. Are you looking at going that broad? Or are you just going to kind of like set up on the main distribution lines, Red Hat, Debian, Ubuntu, Mint, stuff like that?
Yeah, we're going to try to hit the more mainstream ones first from a coverage standpoint, but
that makes sense.
Being built in C++, so to make it as modular and as portable as possible.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
I also saw another question. How do you guys think you compare to other options like Falcon? Definitely not as good as Falcon, but I'd say they're somewhat different use cases, at least initially. At least like where we are today. So we're not kind of like the full scope EDR that you might run. And Falcon obviously has a huge team supporting it to look for developed signatures, develop the product. I'd say we do a decent job at some of the more basic stuff in surfacing it. And then the more kind of advanced, like new threats that are more behavior focused is where BlueSpawn would currently fall short compared to some of the more commercial AVs that are pretty heavily using machine learning these days.
Cool. All right, let's hold the questions there till maybe the next break. What are you going to do next? Are we doing demo? Or are we going straight into the workshop?
We're going to go right into the workshop.
Fantastic.
So you're going to be connecting to server 12 R2 EC2 instance running in my AWS account. Don't do bad things. I'm monitoring them. I have shells on all of them. So maybe you can do something and get away with it. Maybe you can't, but you probably don't want to take the chance of being caught with all the logging on there. And we're going to do a step-by-step tool. I'll do it up here. As long as you registered for the workshop, you got an email probably around 10 a.m. or so. And that contained an IP address, and then administrator, Superblue Chiapet 9 bang. That was the password of the day I decided to go with. So you can look for that and you should be able to RDP into that. If you're on Windows, just search remote desktop connection. Linux and Mac, there's also apps for. Yes, that is Chiapet 1 or some version of Chiapet is my favorite password, and that's a result of Mubix's influence in setting Chiapet 1 in our region on all the boxes for years. You can do this in a VM, but you're connecting to another VM, so it's sandboxed in that way. So if you don't feel comfortable connecting directly from your host to the VM, you're welcome to use a VM, but you should be plenty enough fine as long as you trust RDP connection to RDP to your VM. Yeah, if you're having trouble connecting, just try reconnecting. I have a few extra ones if there is any issues, but for now, yeah, you should just be able to reconnect if it fails. Make sure you got the right IP address and account and password. I've connected to all of them. So they do work, but there could be issues. Spinning up 156 or so VMs is challenging.
Yeah. So a question that came up before is, how long is access to this going to be available?
I'm going to tear them down probably after the workshop, within like an hour or two tops, just because they are running. Amazon has been very nice enough to give us some funds to use for Blue Spawn workshops and whatnot. Some free AWS credits, but those are not unlimited and don't grow on trees. But if you'd like to sponsor Blue Spawn or know a contact at AWS, feel free to let them know that they should give us more credits. But yeah, we'll probably kill them shortly after.
Yeah, but if the client's open source and downloadable, and it sounds like it's pretty easy to deploy, you should be able to do this, folks, in your own VMware VirtualBox environment and play around with it.
And I was going to talk about that more later, but it's all about figuring out your own kind of setup for conducting security research, whether that's using AWS VMs, but the tool is out there, all the code is out there. You can find plenty of examples. There's a few examples on our wiki about how to find malware, or like example malicious commands you can run, like registry run keys you could set. But at the end of the day, trying out offensive tools. So spawning an interpreter beacon on your machine and then running Blue Spawn is a great way to figure out how it works.
That's a good point. And you know what? You learn so much when you do stuff that way. My students, I have them do that in my labs at Cal Poly and at Coastline in my pen testing classes. And I have a lot of my students tell me they learn more setting up the lab than they do sometimes, going through the steps of the lab. So yeah, that's just kind of comes with the territory, folks.
Yep. So as you can see here, I'm connecting over RDP. Super Blue Chia Pet 9 bang, and you guys can do this and follow along. There's instructions.txt on your on the desktop that will have the commands that I'm going to run, and as well as the malware that is deployed is all right there in a malware folder on the desktop. So you can also copy that down. There is a question I saw about making OVAs available that you can share afterwards. The answer is yes. I'm working with the WRCCDC team we'll sys prep a VM. I was talking to Wasabi about that.
Yeah, Wasabi. We'll probably put it in our repository where we put all of the images from our past competitions. So that's perfect.
Yeah. So we'll work to get that. It might take a bit for that, but you have the commands and whatnot used.
We'll tweet that out once it's all done, and I'll spread it through my channel as well. So stay tuned.
Here's the instructions we're going to use. Here is all your lovely Cobalt Strike beacons calling back to my C2 server running in the cloud. There's all 150 of you or so just calling back, beaconing nicely. Anyways, so we have our instructions.txt file here. If we win our, oh boy, that font is very, very small. Let's change that. I'm going to post a few extra IP addresses to everyone. Let's see. Actually, Dr. Brown, I'm going to send you a handful of IP addresses that you can send to the people that are having trouble in chat, and they can try one of those.
Okay. Whoa, slow down. It says, hold on. Let me get this copied over to like a notepad or something.
Check your spam folder or so is another place. If you're having trouble, worst case, if it doesn't work, you can just follow along up here. And that'll have to be good enough for today. So let's see here. Whoa, that's worse. All right, still not super. Let me change the
Eric,
screen resolution.
there's your IP. All right. Scott, Brian, I'm going to send you an IP.
Let's see if I can do settings. All right, maybe that might have to be the size we'll go with today. If you do type WinR and then CMD, you can open an administrative command prompt. Some people will say use PowerShell. I am a huge fan of command prompts. Command prompt, if you know how to use it, is quite powerful, more powerful than a lot of people realize. And the tool is just an exe, so you can launch it from PowerShell. You can launch it from just command prompt. If your command prompt is really small, I know it's hard to say, but if you type mode space and then like 150 or 200, you can get a wider command prompt. That's something that might be helpful. So like if I type mode 175 here, my command prompt will get a bit wider. So I have a bit more screen real estate here. So I'm going to run the first thing. We're going to do a hunt for 1546. And that is accessibility features. So yeah, I got to actually, so it's on the desktop. So you're going to have to CD to the desktop. And then you can see Blue Spawn running here. I know it's hard to see. I don't know how to make the text any bigger, but you can do this on your own computer too, or your own VM. And you can kind of see here. Let me, if I take a screenshot. So here's a bit, whoops.
Jake, did you try properties font size?
Yeah, I'm at the max size of the font, Connor.
Rip.
Yep. But here, so we can see what it detected. It saw the on-screen keyboard and Seth C, which is another one of the accessibility backdoors that you can do. And you can see that they were configured to run command prompt when pressed. So now if we go back to our RDP session and run the next command, we can run it with the remove value reaction. And what that'll do is prompt us to remove the malware as it finds it. So it's like, do you want to remove it? Yes. Do you want to remove the other sticky keys backdoor? Yes. And I'll take another screenshot to kind of zoom in here. We'll get rid of our other one. And so you can kind of see how it prompted. It prompted us, do you want to remove right in here? Do you want to remove this registry key? And we said yes. And then it went ahead and removed that particular instance of the sticky keys backdoor there. And while I'm at it, every time we do a hunt, if we pass the XML flag, we can log. So this is an example. It's logging to the console, but we've also set it to log to XML. So you have a nice report you have that you can use for incident response efforts. So if you could say that, oh, we detected this malware at this specific time, and here's what the contents of it. And that's very helpful for being able to report and say, hey, this is when we found the malware and this is how we reacted to it. So we're going to go ahead and run all, we'll clear our terminal. We can run all hunts at cursory now. So we'll see what other stuff pops up. And we've removed stuff. Oops. Oh, we're just hunting for 1546. Oops, I forgot to change that. Remove the dash hunts equal and the technique number. And that'll make it go for all hunts. So if now we try running it again, we should see some more malware. Hard to see, but it's located a registry run key. And I'll go ahead and zoom in here a second again, once it's found a few more pieces of the malware. So this is a great example of what I said about Blue Spawn having some false positives and letting the operator figure out how to respond to them. So the first one, and I know it's still a bit hard to see, but it was a registry run key that was IEX invoke new object, download string from my C2 server and execute it. So that was an example of a Cobalt Strike beacon being deployed. And that's obviously something we want to remove. So we responded yes and deleted it. But this next one here, as it happens, sometimes good stuff uses very sketchy looking ways to deploy itself. So in AWS boxes, run DLL 32 to launch a random DLL in system 32 to install the EC2 wallpaper that tells you details about your machine. Blue Spawn flagged that. And of course, it's not malicious. That's default to AWS and EC2 instances. And we could just say, do you want to remove this? And we said, no, we don't want to remove it. But that's just one of those examples where there could be a false positive, but at the very least, you want it to be surfaced to you to be able to make the decision, to be able to go look into that further to see if it really is malicious or not. And then let's do some looking for process injection, because that's always a fun one here. So we paste. So we're doing a hunt for T1055, which is the MITRE attack technique for process injection. Again, we're logging to console and XML. Notice that we changed the thing to the aggressiveness to normal here. So process injection really does have to scan all processes on the system to find evidence of that. So it's going to take a lot longer, but that's okay. We just set the aggressiveness as appropriate, and then it'll do it. And it'll tell you if it cannot run, like if the aggressiveness is not high enough. So I'll take another screenshot here to kind of make the display bigger and get rid of our old guy. So we can see here it found the process injection. It tells you some information like the base address, the memory size, the process it's in, and it's flagged all that to help you figure out how to respond to that. So it located that process injection, and then if we run with the carve memory reaction, we'll be able to find and remove that beacon from memory. And it might prompt you a couple times here, just because the malicious code often lives in multiple memory sections. So it's removing it multiple times. And we don't want to delete PowerShell. It flagged the file, but that's not something we want to delete here. Oh, wait, never mind. It's still flagging the process command line, I see. So carve out infected memory section, we keep saying yes. And you'll see it tells you that, I know it's hard to see, thread ID 2456 was executing malicious code at this address, and we terminated it. So that's just that process injection. And so I'll make that bigger again. So we saw the process injection, and this time we wanted to react to it with the carve memory reaction. And we went and carved that specific section out of memory and killed the beacon. And if I pull up our Cobalt Strike terminal, my machine was running on, let's see which one I was. I was running on, ooh, my EC2 instance refreshed. I was running on 152. So if we see the beacon 152 here, it'll probably stop checking in here in about 20 seconds or so. This is one of those where you might have to run it a couple times just to fully remove all the malicious memory sections. But we'll see here. Oh, it's still checking in here. Let me make sure I got the right VM. Let's Let's go ahead and run our script again, or run BlueSpawn again. And this will work for other types of beacons, particularly Metasploit it's good at. There was a feature that could actually rip out the Cobalt Strike configurations from memory too. So to figure out the actual C2 config. Currently that feature is disabled, but we'll be bringing it back shortly. But that's always fun to dump the beacon configuration, the malleable C2 profile that the attacker is using. And so what I'll do is I'll give probably for the next like 5 minutes or so, if folks want to just kind of poke around inside their EC2 instance, try running BlueSpawn, the malware that was deployed, the EXEs, and some other things. You can see the deploy script in here is what actually deployed the various pieces of malware. And then there's some tools like Process Hacker and Sysinternals that are installed if you want to go look at some of the malware that's running. So like here's our malicious PowerShell running in memory. And so you can go take a look at what that looks like. So I guess we'll give I'm working out the Eastern time zone, but at 37, we'll resume the presentation slides and kind of go through one last threat hunting section and then a conclusion.
Cool. Just so everybody knows, disclaimer here, ethical disclaimer. If you download that malware folder to your home system, please be careful. Western Regional Cyber Defense competition is not to be held at fault in any way, shape, or form if you nuke your own system. So don't blame us.
Yep, that's a good point.
You've been warned.
One other note, I saw a question in the chat. Right now, BlueSpawn is more of like an independent EXE that you don't have to install. We're going to have an installable Windows service here, like probably in the next couple months, hopefully. We're still working on that. But right now, it's a tool that you could just quickly download, run, and get results and not have to install it. And then when we install it in the future, that'll be an easier way to configure it to be monitoring your system and more.
Nice. I'm actually I have all kinds of ideas of how I can incorporate this into my classes now. This is wonderful. Although I'm going to have a hard time because I want to put this in our NetLab environment at Coastline for our Pen Test Plus class and maybe our ethical hacking class. And I know I'm going to have a fight with IT. What do you mean you want to install malware? Ask that. Hopefully, Randolph Morris, Jake will answer that question. Gets back. It's a good question. You know, I could just give IT the VM for the NetLab environment and see if they even look at it. It's a closed system. It's an air gap system anyway. All the NetLab environments at Coastline do not have access to the internet. Yeah, I know, right? So, Jake, there was a question in chat. Are you guys considering a GUI wrapper for BlueSpawn? Oh, he's now putting his ears in. Can you hear me, Jake?
I am back. I was getting some more water.
All right. Perfect. Yeah, well deserved. There's a question in chat. Ever consider creating a GUI wrapper for BlueSpawn?
Yes. we were putting that off till we have the Windows service component. So once we have a Windows service, it'll make a lot more sense to have a little GUI, like something in the notification tray. We focused a lot of our work on building out the base. So you can look at the code obviously on GitHub now or after it, but you'll see there's massive custom modules that we wrote for handling file system interaction, handling registry interaction. And that makes the hunts a lot cleaner to write and all. So that's where we focused a lot of the work in building out kind of like almost a proof of concept, but like a little bit more like proof of concept version 2 or MVP like 2. And then now once, at least in our opinion, it's certainly proved useful, at least in our experiences in hunting down malware and all. So now we're going to, the next kind of phase is building out a server component, making it a bit nicer around the edges, whether that's with a GUI and Windows service, whether that's adding just bug fixes and stuff like reducing false positives. So different things like that for sure.
Nice. Do you have a development roadmap for it? Have you set up all these guidelines for the new service, the GUI, the threat hunting improvements? Do you have a timeline at all that you've published?
We do have a project roadmap.
Okay.
The project roadmap hasn't been updated in a month or two, as we've been just really busy with some other life things going on.
No, sure, I'm sure.
And only working on this in our free time. But there is, we have jotted down some of the ideas that some of the next features we've been looking at. And then there's also, we track everything through GitHub issues. So there is GitHub issues. I realize I'm not on the screen here. But we have the wiki, as some examples of how to try Blue Spawn in action. If you're interested in developing, which I'll talk about again later, we have the commands to set up a development environment to try building the tool yourself. Some of the project roadmap is just written out in just like a quick bullet point form, but some of the things we're looking at longer term, some on the software architecture. So some of the stuff that we've talked about today goes in explaining more the details of what the different macros in C++ do. And then there's issues to kind of track stuff, and everything follows the Git flow version control. So if we go to look at the network, I guess, you'll see like there's a master branch, there's a development branch, and then there's feature branches.
Nice. Very nice. All right. So a couple questions, and Kenneth, you took the words right out of my mouth, sir. Are you going to approach Microsoft about this? Have they approached you? Are you guys going to take this commercial? When can I get part of the IPO?
Yeah. So
are you looking for venture capital? I mean, what's the story?
We've been doing this kind of just on our own as we personally, I guess our core development team, we use it very much as kind of like a vehicle for our own cybersecurity research. So as we learn about different malware techniques, things, we'll add hunts for them. As we've learned to better program and whatnot, we built new features. As we learn to write malware ourselves, we will add defenses to our program for the malware we write. So it's kind of like a back and forth of using it to kind of document everything that we learn about and all, because if it's not documented, you don't know it. At least I'm a strong believer of that philosophy. So different things like that. We're working to get it like signed, but that requires money. So we're working on funding. But yeah, the plan is to keep it as an open source project and all.
Sure. So 2 questions here. First from Pond Muncher. Do you have a Discord channel that you're sharing outside?
We do. And all the development talks in there. So if you go on the homepage, there's a Discord button and join it there. I'll post a link here. As you mentioned that. Here is a Discord invite link. We do all our development communications in there. It's not meant to be a private channel. There's plenty of people in there. So you can chat with us if you are running the tool and have a question or you run into some bug and you post there. We will be happy to answer your questions Like when we chat
Awesome.
about new features and new research that we want to add, that's the channel we do it in. It's not in like some super secret squirrel thing. Because one of the things is making this tool available to the community, and that's how it gets better, right? So offensive tools are very heavily published in the community, but not much on the defensive side. So anything we can do to help that is something that we want to do for sure. And that's like, if you want to get into defensive security, right? It's hard to get your hands on an AV or EDR to try to see how they work. But using kind of this is hopefully we make Bluespawn as a kind of a model for helping you figure out how defensive software works, so you can go write your own, so you can use that experience when you go work at some of the commercial vendors too.
Sure. And that actually brings up a good point. It was one of the things that I was going to suggest that you maybe explore on your development roadmap is any type of a capture that you can put within the program that would help with malware reverse engineering, because that's where a lot of these programs really lack, or you have to have them integrated with third-party systems. And the other question I was going to say, do you have a GoFundMe?
We do not have a GoFundMe. That's a
Oh,
great idea.
I think you need to get somebody on that like yesterday.
We'll
Let
have to
me know
make
if you
that.
need some. Let me know if you need some help. I can help you out with that.
Yeah, we might set up GitHub sponsors too, now that you mention it.
Yeah,
I
GitHub
thought
sponsors.
we had talked about it. We just never had gotten around to it, I think. Certainly, though, it's something we'll consider doing. I think I'm going to go ahead and start the final kind of set of slides now. The VMs will stay up for probably another 45 minutes or so. Just depends on when I want to run Terraform destroy and just kill all those nice shells and whatnot that I have beaconing out still. So what is MITRE ATT&CK? Just a bit more on this. It's a framework for understanding adversary behavior. For me and our team, I know it's served as a way we think about how to defend our systems. So we think about this very much, just like coding our logic into Bluespawn. We think about it as a way to figure out how the attackers are going to breach our systems, and then how what activities they're going to do, and then how we can stop them, and figuring out, just like those landmines I talked about earlier, that's how we think about figuring out what's the best way to stop attackers. How do we set up those tripwires, so when they do that technique and dump those credentials, we spot them and be like, we got you. So building your own detections, analyzing a technique. So this is an example. The link is there in the slides. If you just search MITRE ATT&CK technique 1547, it'll pop right up. But I wanted to explain some of the methodology about how you go about conducting research on your own to write a new hunt, but even to write your own generic detection outside of Bluespawn in particular. So this is the MITRE ATT&CK page, or at least a couple screenshots of it, and they have other things on the page, like examples of attackers using it and different links to blog posts. But it talks a bit about, describes the technique, gives you an example or two, says the following registry keys can be used for persistence. It tells you what tactic, what platforms it's on, what data sources you might find helpful. And all that is good information. But MITRE ATT&CK technique is never, the website is never meant to be like fully comprehensive. Maybe it will one day, but there is infinite amounts of hours you could spend just writing out all the information to fully understand one specific technique. There's hundreds of registry keys on a Windows system that is more than you could reasonably document on their one page. So the framework is really a starting point. So you look at technique 1547, sub-technique 001, and you use that as the starting page for your research to figure out you're experimenting, figuring out what attackers are doing in the real world with it, and use that as the basis. And then once you've kind of done that, you can begin to maybe try to write a rudimentary detection for it. And so here is an example of part of the code behind our hunt for 1547-001. So you see we define some registry keys, and then we we scan them. And it's meant to be pretty simple for all the things. Look at all the keys, and scan those process command lines, because it's a registry run key here. And then if the scan module comes back with anything, we can create a detection and note it's a command reference. And then Blue Spawn can automatically go ahead and say, all right, we saw a command reference. It knows to scan the exe that was run. So if you did cmd.exe/c and then a command, it knows to look at the command line and then like the actual program. So it's able to parse the command line there as an example. But you would write a detection for this, and then you would try to break the detection. And if you could figure out a bypass to the detection, then you go back to the drawing board, go back to the coding block to figure out how you can defend against it. And that's kind of that going back and forth between attacking something and then defending it and then attacking it again. And that's how the detections get approved over time. So when you see a weaker detection, that means that there hasn't been as much effort to get full coverage on that, or we know that there's plenty of bypass techniques out there for. But the more you repeat that process, after you repeat that process a couple of times and a couple of cycles, the detections start getting really, really hard to beat. And it takes a lot more time for an attacker to figure out how to bypass them. So every minute you spend writing up a detection can also make the attacker spend more time, or at least worrying about if they are going to get caught. Here's more of the code associated with technique 1547.001. You see we check some registry keys above, and there's additional registry keys that we check if you're to look at the code. Here we look at this the startup folder. So the startup folder in both program data, which is machine wide, and then the users folder. So we get a list of user folders on the system, and then we go check their startup folders. And then we scan all the files in that directory to see if there is anything bad. So looking at the executable, is it signed, and things like that. So this is just at the hunt mode, and then the scan mode is another module where it takes place of figuring out how malicious something is and figuring out associations. So I want to talk a bit more too about when you're building your own detections. And I like that we already mentioned that before this, it already came out. Setting up your own lab environment. There's great resources online about how to do that. And Red Team relies on a lot of open source tools. Mimikatz, Metasploit, Sliver. Sliver was one they used a lot at nationals this year. They use DNS, command and control. But there's, if you search C2 Matrix, there's like 20 plus open source things, maybe 30 plus at this point, of just command and control frameworks. There's other tools like PyPyCats and every other offensive security tool under the sun. You can try out those tools and then run them on your system in a VM in some safe place, right? So you're not destroying your own system. I mean, maybe you do it on your own system, but you're liable if you run the malware on your own system and it messes your computer up for sure. We're not liable for that. But running the tools in a lab environment, looking at how to, what signals they might give off, right? So like what do they look like when you see it in Process Hacker? Look at some of the memory sections, and there is so many things that we've kind of picked up over the years of just small little tricks, from setting up the various pieces of tooling and then seeing how to detect it. And then bolded at the bottom, no normal, find evil, right? You have to spend a lot of quality time with these operating systems. Unfortunately, there's just no better way in my experience, but spending time installing Windows, building a lab teaches you a lot. Try installing the applications. Once you get a sense of what's normal, what normal processes are and all in the operating system, then you can start applying that knowledge to find evil, figure out what a malicious process might look like. And then once you do, you can begin to code that logic into your own tool, into BlueSpawn, into other items, or write like a YAR rule to detect some specific C2. And that's certainly one area where I would like to see the community do more, I think, is there's a lot of open source offensive security tools, but there's not a lot of detections accompanying those. So some of the tools like Mimikatz, Benjamin Depley will release YAR rules to detect Mimikatz, the release versions at least, alongside his tools. So not all tools do that though. So there's a lot of opportunity to write YAR rules and practice your hand about to figure out how to detect some of these various tools. We already went over contributing code. If you go to the BlueSpawn repository and go to wiki, there's instructions there, and there's also a Discord link on the README that you can get in touch if you have questions and want to help in any way, or just have a feature suggestion, right? So feature work for the tool of where we're thinking about it is probably 3 areas. First is coverage. That's pretty obvious, of looking at adding new hunts, new mitigations, new data sources, running something, say, in every process, like a DLL to catch hooking. Things like that will allow us to expand the scope of what BlueSpawn sees. The more BlueSpawn sees, the more it can detect. And then configurability. So we mentioned earlier today about making it easier to control. Maybe we have a config file that lets you install it as a service, right? That's one of the goals we're working towards. Making signatures more modular and easy to be added is something we're thinking about. And integrity. One of the areas that is really difficult when developing an antivirus that we learned is testing. It's hard enough to write test cases for like a program you write, just like a generic simple program you might write for school. But one of the open questions that even the EDR vendors, like some of the well-known vendors, I won't name any, what they're struggling with is testing. Figuring out how to reliably test these black box tools that have become so complicated and be able to detect so many things. Atomic Red Team goes a bit of the way there, but even still, it's somewhat limited in what it can, what threats it can emulate. And so hopefully we'll eventually add better automated testing, but that's a lot of rolling your own for that. Protecting BlueSpawn from tampering, so making sure red spawn or whatever other red team things that they come up with is harder for, makes it more difficult for BlueSpawn to be tampered with from running in any way. Making sure the data sources it gets are genuine. And we publish the roadmap of things we're looking at. A Linux client soon. It kind of builds, but we're still working on it. BlueSpawn server. We've gotten some RPC between the client to a server, and that's going to be in Go. And then very long term in the future, we'll eventually have BlueSpawn Cloud as the kind of final piece to emulate real commercial products. The commercial products these days work, they'll see stuff, and if they haven't seen a file before, they'll send it up to the cloud for analysis, whether you like it or not in most cases. And we view the opportunities for BlueSpawn Cloud the same way, that it could provide deeper analysis that you wouldn't necessarily be able to provide on the client. So we have about 6 minutes to reach our 2-hour mark. So we're right on time. BlueSpawn in a nutshell. It's fully open source. You can download it today and play with it. It attempts to demonstrate how these modern day security solutions work, doing it in an open source, transparent manner. So red team can see the detections, blue team can see the detections. Maybe you can find a bypass to them, and then you can go contribute code, or at least think about how you might bypass, and then write a detection to catch any people that bypass. So it's one of those things where it's a push and pull between red and blue, but And if you iterate enough, that's how the tools get better. We integrate a lot of community libraries, whether that's MITRE ATT&CK as like the framework for how we think about defense, as well as stuff like YAR rules that are published by the community, with the end goal being that we think about Blue Spawn as, if I give you any compromised machine, at least at this moment in time, and eventually it'll be like a whole network, right? But if we give you a compromised machine, I want you to be able to find malware and then remediate it as fast as humanly possible. And that goes back to our opening slide. If malware is executing on the system, I want to be able to know about it and find it as quickly as possible.
So that brings up a good question, actually, Jake, because we had somebody ask in the chat, does Blue Spawn facilitate the removal of the virus itself, or is it just the detector and you got to figure out how to remove it?
Yeah, so that's that reaction module. So like the carve memory, stopping process injection, deleting file if it identifies a file. It's not going to automatically remove the file for you, but it's going to tell you like, hey, do you want to remove this file? We think it's malicious. And then you can do the rest of the due diligence or use the available information to go ahead and make that decision. About updating the techniques and whatnot. Currently, yeah, you just have to re-download the releases. Once we get it in a lot more stable state, when there's a sort of like Windows service kind of component, then we'll work to add a way to easily update the definitions without having to re-download the code each time. That's just another challenge to work through. So that's something we haven't addressed yet, but that's a great thinking. And that's one of the cool things with like Windows Defender, for example. They push out signature updates somewhere north of like 8 to 10 times a day, I think, usually, to every single machine that's running Windows Defender, right? And so if you think about it, that really can help when there's a new attack. That's how you can help spot it and quickly protect so many machines at once.
Got it. Any chance you could demo that? Unfortunately, I think we're about out of time, Brian. Maybe we can ask Blue Spawn to come back at a later training. We're getting ready to kick off our season here in the Western region. Thank you, everybody. Big round of applause.
We have a few more slides. If
I apologize. I'm sorry. I thought you were wrapping up. I'm so sorry.
I saw the questions I want to make sure to answer. But yeah, applying the Blue Spawn concepts that we talked about today, applying the ideas of threat hunting and active defense, right? Figuring out how to align your defenses with attacker techniques and tactics. That'll help. You can look at tools like MITRE ATT&CK to figure out how to do that and just kind of work through. And it takes a lot of time and research, but you'll get there eventually. And once you look at one technique, you can start to expand and look at a second technique and kind of go from there. One of my favorite quotes, and my teammates probably, I probably drive them crazy for saying this, but knowing your coverage is something we found very important. If you can have confidence in certain lines of effort, that'll enable you to focus more in other areas. So that's the idea, that if you are reasonably sure that you'll get some sort of detection or the red team just won't be able to use some certain technique, you can spend your other time looking at other techniques. You can look for malware in other places on the system. And if you can do that, you can greatly expand the amount of coverage you have for detecting red team malware. And then understanding how defenses operate. So the code is all open source. If you're like, I wonder how the scan module really works, and I don't want to take Jake's word for it, you should go look at it and tear it apart. And see how defensive software works, so it can be approved, right? There's plenty of bugs that have been found in antivirus software over the years just by tearing it apart. And I've seen malware leverage antivirus software to use it for privilege escalation. So understand how defenses work. You can figure out bypasses. Worth mentioning again, this tool or any other tool is not the solution. You thinking about how to defend your systems, understanding the coverage, you can then utilize those threat hunting concepts to defend your system. So the human is at the end of the day the one that's stopping the threat with the tools and other resources they have available to them. And I believe this is my last slide. Actually, this time, since we're right at I guess 12 o'clock or so at Pacific time, if my time zone conversions are right. But I'll upload the slides from today's workshop to the repository somewhat soonish. I'll also post them in the Discord pretty shortly. There's an email. You can email us or send us a note in Discord. If you have ideas, just want to ask questions and whatnot. We'll work with the WRCCDC team to see if we can't publish some sort of OVA from the workshop today. But other than that, we really appreciate you all coming out and figuring out, learning what you need, threat hunting concepts and whatnot to help stop the red team next year and just generally up the game. So thank you.
All right. Oops. Thank you very much, Jake. I greatly appreciate it. So before we wrap up today here, folks, I just have a couple of announcements. Can I get the screen back if you don't mind?
Oh,
Jake?
Yeah. Let me go ahead and stop sharing.
All right. Let
stop
me go to screen 2. Got it. So I'm gonna do my shameless plug here for WRCCDC. Just get my icons and everything moved around here. So we have another training next week, folks. If you signed up for this training, you will automatically get the emails and blasts and everything else for next week. Next week, we have Tenable, who is going to be going over their Nessus product. It's not going to be as long as this training. It's we're only anticipating maybe in 45 minutes to an hour. So you'll get the email blast on that. Secondly, we have an invitational coming up here in 2 weeks on the 21st. And if you go to our website at WRCCDC.org, and then you go to the, I believe it's under participate. No, I'm sorry, seasons, excuse me, seasons. I should know my own website, right? If you go to 2021, there is a November invitational registration. Again, WRCCDC.org. Go to seasons 2021. There is a form there for you to fill out. Now, if you've already signed up for it, you're good. Don't worry about it. You'll be getting a lot of information here in the next week or so, as in terms of the invitational. But we have about 4 or 5 slots left. We can take about 24, 25 teams. We have 20 teams signed up right now. This is open to teams outside of the Western region, as long as we do not get an overflow of Western regional schools. And right now, it doesn't look like we're going to have that. We have, I think, Central Florida and Indiana Tech that are signed up from outside of the region. Any schools that are outside of the region, it's first come, first serve. So if you want a chance at getting your team together and practicing, this is a good invitational to do it. Nothing more than bragging rights from a winning perspective. We'll tweet out the winners usually a day or two after the invitational. Again, that is November 21st. It runs from about 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Pacific time. So if you have any questions, you can hit me up at the One Pro Bro on Twitter or email me, brandon.brown@wrccd.org. I'll throw that in the chat real quick. And thank you very much. You'll find this video on YouTube. If you want to go back and see it again at your leisure, please, by all means. And I want to wish everybody a great day. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Bye, all. We'll kill the VMs probably in like a
Thanks.
half hour or so.
Good talk,
I'll
Jake.
stay on if people have any additional questions too for a bit. Looks like a fair number of the beacons were killed. I'd say maybe, it's hard to count, but like I'd say looks like about half maybe ended up getting killed. So, and I spun up more than actual people showed up too. So And everyone
yeah,
did join.
I have,
So
yeah, I have counts. Hold on, let me kill the YouTube thing here, and I can go back and edit that later.